Who was Alexander the Great? How did a small kingdom nestled in the north of Greece manage to dominate the ancient world? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life, and every video immerses you in the destinies of those who shaped the world. Today, get ready to travel back in time and follow the meteoric rise of Alexander the Great. In less than 10 years, this young king of Macedonia reshaped the ancient world, crossing mountains, deserts, and gigantic rivers, facing the most formidable armies of his time. Relentless strategy, insane audacity, limitless ambition. His name has become legendary, caught between triumph and mystery. But beyond the myth, who really was this man who dreamed of a borderless empire? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you and enjoy your journey. In the 4th century before Christ, Europe and the Near East formed a vast array of territories with multiple political and cultural identities. To understand the rise of Alexander the Great, it is essential first to grasp the context in which he operated, as Macedonia was not yet the dominant power we know today. At that time, the Mediterranean world was marked by the influence of the Greek city-states and the vast presence of the acumenid Persian Empire. This empire, stretching over thousands of kilometers, dominated from Egypt to Central Asia and exerted a major cultural and economic attraction on its neighbors. In this complex and often divided landscape, Macedonia, once on the sidelines, gradually rose to the forefront thanks to the political and military reforms of its king, Philip II. In the Greek world, the period is often called the Late Classical Era. The most famous city-states, like Athens, Sparta, or Thebes, are still marked by the wars that have shaped their recent pasts. The Peloponnesian War between 431 to 404 before Christ, for instance, considerably weakened Athens, while Sparta, long considered the greatest land military power, also suffered from successive conflicts where Thebes, after its moment of glory, struggles to maintain its influence. Each of these cities is jealous of its independence, its customs, and its form of government. Athens still embodies the democratic ideal, even though it has evolved greatly since Pericles, while Sparta remains attached to its oligarchic and military model. These differences only reinforce rivalries, often tinged with pride and hostility, to the point of making any lasting alliance extremely precarious. Faced with these internal divisions, the Persians appear as the most formidable power in the region. For generations, the acumenid Persian Empire has exerted a direct or indirect influence on the Greek world, especially in Asia Minor, where many Greek cities have come under its control or live under its protection. To the Greeks of the time, the Persians appear as both a threat and a potential trading partner, as their vast caravan routes open up prospects for the exchange of precious goods, ideas, and even skilled craftsmen. The Greco-Persian Wars, 2 centuries earlier, left a legendary imprint. The battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis forged the feeling of a common Greek identity, despite the dissensions. However, this spirit of unity, born during the confrontations with the Persian Empire, quickly faded in the internal quarrels of the Greek world. Thus, by the mid-4th century before Christ, no city-state had the strength or cohesion necessary to dominate the others or seriously threaten the great Eastern Empire. It is in this context of endemic rivalries and reciprocal fragilities that Macedonia makes its appearance on the international stage. Located to the north of mainland Greece, Macedonia possesses a contrasting geography. Imposing mountains border its frontiers, protecting its strategic heartland, while its plains offer agricultural lands suitable for farming and cultivation. This geographical setup long limits its maritime access, hindering its commercial development and partially distancing it from the great Greek trade routes. Moreover, Macedonia is regarded by many southern Greeks as a still barbaric country. This term, in the Greek mindset, encompasses both the feeling of cultural strangeness and the idea that this territory has not fully adopted the refinements of Hellenic civilization, meaning the set of values, institutions, and artistic and philosophical expressions that define the classical Greek world. Although its rulers claim common ancestry with certain Greek lineages, Macedonia remains on the fringes of the political life of city-states until relatively recent times. Macedonia presents itself in the form of a kingdom, where power is exercised hereditarily by a monarch. This radically differentiates it from the city-state model, accustomed to oligarchic, democratic, or tyrannical regimes, but rarely to the concept of a powerful and stable monarchy. This political configuration, while it may seem less sophisticated in the eyes of Athenians or Spartans, provides Macedonia with a significant advantage: the ability to make strategic decisions quickly and to maintain a strong army under the unique command of a king. Over time, many conflicts between the Macedonian elites and the royal court have occurred, but the rulers gradually managed to consolidate their authority. This centralization of power will offer the kingdom an unprecedented logistical and military advantage, precisely when it embarks on wars of conquest. The major turning point for Macedonia occurs when Philip II ascends the throne in 359 before Christ. At his accession, the kingdom is weakened by incursions from the Illyrians, an Indo-European people established in the Western Balkans, who regularly threatened the Macedonian borders with raids and attacks. Armed with experience gained as a hostage in the city of Thebes, where he was able to closely observe Greek military tactics, he quickly implements a series of reforms that will durably transform the Macedonian army. His main innovation consists of perfecting the phalanx, this tight infantry formation inherited from the Greeks, by equipping it with the sarissa, a much longer spear than those previously used. Thanks to this weapon, the Macedonian phalanx acquires superior reach, giving it a clear advantage over opposing troops. At the same time, Philip II develops an elite cavalry, mainly composed of Macedonian nobles called companions. This cavalry will play a decisive role in future battles, destabilizing enemy lines with rapid and massive charges. Beyond the purely military aspect, Philip II demonstrates remarkable diplomatic skill. He takes advantage of the dissensions between Greek city-states to gradually expand Macedonia's influence to the south. Through threat or negotiation, he manages to place Macedonian garrisons in strategic regions. His objective is not necessarily to destroy the city-states, but rather to control them, or even integrate them into alliances beneficial to his ambitions. He thus organizes the League of Corinth, a coalition that unites most of the Greek city-states under his leadership, justified by the idea of a pan-Hellenic war against the Persian Empire. This political maneuver, unprecedented in its scope, gives Philip II a new legitimacy, that of leading all the Greeks, not only to defend their interests against the Persians, but also to ensure internal peace. In a few years, Macedonia thus transforms into a major power, whose influence now extends beyond its mountainous borders and stretches to the confines of classical Greece. By consolidating his kingdom and revolutionizing its military organization, Philip II lays the foundations that will allow his son, Alexander, to embark on one of the greatest epics of antiquity. Without the decisive action of this visionary king, Macedonia would likely have remained a peripheral state, incapable of rivaling the Persian Empire, or even of unsettling cities like Sparta or Athens. Alexandra was born in 356 before Christ in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. The circumstances of his birth were steeped in fervor and omens. Ancient chronicles report that on the very night of the delivery, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the great wonders of the world, was consumed by fire. This coincidence, whether purely fortuitous or interpreted deliberately, gave observers of the time the opportunity to proclaim that the goddess was absent because she was assisting at the birth of Alexander. Beyond the legend, this anecdote already illustrates the tendency of contemporaries to read into every celestial sign a mark of the newborn's exceptional destiny. While Philip II's political actions are well known, Olympias, Alexander's mother, also played a significant role in terms of influence. She belonged to the powerful Aeacid family of Epirus, which claimed descent from Neoptolemus, himself a descendant of Achilles. At that time, asserting a prestigious ancestry wasn't just a mythical tale. It served to reinforce the political legitimacy and symbolic place of a lineage. Thus, from birth, Alexander was assigned a fantasized kinship with legendary heroes of Greek tradition. This notion would deeply affect the imagination of the young prince, convinced he was the heir to a grand destiny. Ancient tales also claim that Alexander had, on his father's side, a distant lineage with Heracles. Several Macedonian kings already claimed a link with the demigod, thereby consolidating their right to rule and their proximity to the Olympian deities. Even though modern historians treat these genealogies with caution, it remains that the assertion of such legendary ancestries contributes to the dynasty's prestige and fuels the belief that Alexander is destined to accomplish heroic feats. Unlike the southern Greek cities, such as Athens and Sparta, Macedonia retained a more rural lifestyle and customs sometimes considered barbaric by Hellenic elites. However, Greek influence was already well established, particularly within the Macedonian high society. The Macedonians, aware of the cultural influence of the Greek world, gradually adopted Greek language, literature, and certain aspects of Greek philosophy. Alexander thus grew up in an environment that valued both military strength, considered essential for the survival and expansion of the kingdom, and intellectual refinement, supported by the heritage of Hellenic poets and thinkers. The young prince studied the foundational texts of Greek culture early on, the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, which recount the Trojan War and Odysseus's return to his native island. For Alexander, the Iliad held particular importance as it featured his mythical ancestor, Achilles. According to some anecdotes, he even kept an annotated copy of this text under his pillow, next to a dagger. If we trust these accounts, reading Homer taught him the spirit of bravery, the quest for glory, and the notion of honor, virtues that would become central in his own life as a soldier and king. In addition to these readings, other disciplines of classical Greek tradition, such as lyric poetry, rhetoric, and to a lesser extent, mathematics and music, were included. Although Philip II wished for an heir primarily trained in military realities, he also understood the importance of a solid general culture to rule over an increasingly open kingdom. The banquets at the court of Pella, where officers, diplomats, and intellectuals mingled, offered young Alexander the opportunity to familiarize himself with political subtleties. From adolescence, he learned to wield eloquence as well as the sword, a valuable asset in a world where alliances were formed and dissolved partly through charm and persuasion. Among Alexander's teachers, the most illustrious is undoubtedly Aristotle. This philosopher, born in Stagira, Chalcidice, was one of the brightest minds of antiquity. He studied at Plato's Academy in Athens, and built a solid reputation in nearly all fields of knowledge: logic, metaphysics, politics, biology, and even ethics. When Philip II solicited Aristotle to become the young prince's tutor, this choice was not insignificant. It testified to the king's ambition, who wanted to provide his son with the best possible intellectual formation. Aristotle's teaching is not limited to theoretical lessons. He takes Alexander and a few other young Macedonian nobles to a place away from the court, often identified as the Temple of the Nymphs, to provide them with knowledge as varied as it is rigorous. The disciples learn dialectics, that is, the art of reasoning and debating, and also explore nature, observing the plant and animal world to better understand the order of creation. Aristotle's goal is to develop in his students not only memory and knowledge, but also critical thinking. This approach contrasts with more traditional methods, based almost exclusively on recitation and imitation. In this setting, Alexander awakens to philosophy, science, and intellectual curiosity. He also discovers politics from an Aristotelian perspective, which focuses on different forms of government, the art of governing, and the virtue of the golden mean. It can be assumed that this education significantly broadens Alexander's horizons, prompting him to think beyond purely military issues. Historians often emphasize that his later interest in founding cities, cultural exchanges, and integrating diverse peoples into his empire owes much to Aristotle's universalist vision. Even though the relationship between teacher and student will not be free of tensions, especially when Alexander adopts certain Persian customs which displeases Aristotle, who remains attached to Greek tradition. Their bond remains one of the most influential in the history of Western thought. Beyond intellectual education, young Alexander becomes familiar very early with the art of war and the practice of command. From his childhood, he observes his father strengthening the Macedonian army, implementing new formations, and perfecting the use of cavalry. In this environment where bravery and discipline are valued, Alexander must prove his worth. One of the most famous episodes of this period concerns the mastery of the horse Bucephalus. According to the tradition reported by historian Plutarch, a Thessalian breeder presented this magnificent horse to Philip II, but the animal, deemed too spirited, seemed uncontrollable and refused to be mounted. While everyone gives up, Alexander, still a teenager, notices that Bucephalus is frightened by its shadow. He then turns the horse to face the sun to calm it and, through gentle and sure actions, manages to tame it. Philip II, observing the scene, is so impressed that he declares to his son, "Find a kingdom equal to your ambitions, for Macedonia is too small for you." Whether it is an accurate historical account or an embellished anecdote, this story of Bucephalus reflects the image of Alexander as a bold young prince, confident in his abilities and possessing a keen sense of observation. Bucephalus will become his loyal steed, accompanying him in almost all his battles until Asia. In parallel, Philip II is quick to involve his son in the military campaigns he undertakes to expand his kingdom and pacify its borders. At only 16, Alexander is entrusted with the Regency of Macedonia during his father's absence. When rebellious tribes threaten the established order, he proves himself up to the task, suppressing the revolt effectively. Shortly afterward, Philip II takes him on more significant expeditions, where Alexander sometimes commands a part of the cavalry. It is an opportunity for him to apply the theoretical teachings on tactics and strategy and strengthen his authority with the Macedonian soldiers. These early experiences forge his martial character and give him a reputation as a capable leader, appreciated by his men. According to some accounts, he already shows fearlessness on the battlefield, not hesitating to take risks himself to lead his troops into combat. He also learns to deal with more experienced generals, to observe the adversary, and to seize the opportune moment to launch an offensive. In a rapidly expanding Macedonia, the young heir proves himself and gains recognition from the military elite, which will be crucial when he succeeds his father. We are in 336 before Christ at the Macedonian court of Pella. King Philip II, whose reputation as a strategist and reformer is well established, is about to celebrate the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra in the city of Aigai, the ancient royal capital and sacred place where the ancestors of the Macedonian dynasty rest. The atmosphere is festive. Games and processions are organized to mark the diplomatic union between Macedonia and a neighboring kingdom. Yet, behind the scenes of rejoicing, tensions abound. Philip II has multiplied matrimonial alliances, and while his military conquests have expanded the kingdom's influence, they have also aroused jealousy and conspiracies. It is in this climate that the most dramatic event of the period occurs, the assassination of Philip II, struck down during these celebrations. In an instant, the kingdom finds itself without its sovereign, and the young Alexander, barely 20 years old, must take on an already considerable inheritance. The assassination happens in a flash. Ancient accounts place it during a triumphant procession as Philip II advances amid the crowd, dressed in his finest attire, to attend the ceremonies. The assassin is identified by sources as a certain Pausanias, a member of the royal guard, or, according to other versions, a court insider eager to avenge a past offense. This brutal act immediately sows panic. How could such a powerful king, surrounded by guards and officers, be so easily struck down? The hypotheses multiply. The first theory attributes the murder to a personal quarrel. Pausanias, one of his bodyguards, allegedly harbored a violent grudge against Philip II, accusing him of not delivering justice after an assault he claimed to have been a victim of. Another theory suggests the possibility of a plot hatched by political rivals, worried about Macedonia further strengthening its hegemony over Greece. Some even go so far as to suggest involvement by Queen Olympias, Alexander's mother, who, it is said, feared that the birth of a new heir from another marriage might demote her own son. Modern historians are unable to decide definitively due to a lack of indisputable documents. What is certain, however, is the immediate consequence. The death of Philip II creates a power vacuum that many seek to fill or exploit. Among the Macedonians present, emotion mingles with fear. The court convenes urgently to designate a successor while hastily organizing the funeral of the deceased king, according to the sumptuous rites reserved for Macedonian monarchs. The body of Philip II is cremated with honors in the great royal tumulus of Aigai. But already, each of the dignitaries, officers, and allied or enemy princes is wondering how Macedonia will manage this delicate transition. The Greek cities, too, observe the situation with particular attention, ready to test the solidity of the new Macedonian power. Alexander, the legitimate son of Philip II and Olympias, now finds himself on the front line. Most ancient testimonies agree that he acts with impressive determination and speed. Even before confusion overtakes the political elites, he claims his place on the throne. He is supported by a significant part of the Macedonian army, particularly the companion cavalry, which has already been able to appreciate his command talents during several campaigns conducted alongside his father. Aware that his young age may encourage potential competitors, he acts quickly to eliminate or neutralize all who might claim the throne. Collateral members of the royal family, influential generals or courtiers compromised in intrigues are driven out or even executed. These harsh but effective measures allow Alexander to secure the court and gain the trust of renowned officers. In the process, the new king undertakes to rally the Macedonian aristocracy, still marked by Philip II's charisma. He assures noble families that he will continue the policy of expansion, as well as the already well-established military and political organization. Banquets and ceremonies, borrowing from Macedonian traditions, reinforce cohesion around the throne. Despite some reluctance, the majority of the elites understand that only Alexander can continue the work of the late king. Once his authority was consolidated in Macedonia, Alexander turned towards the Greek cities. These had been subdued by Philip II, but some hoped to regain their independence upon hearing of his assassination. Alexander quickly went to Thessaly, then to central Greece, to display the power of his phalanx and cavalry. The cities that resisted, like Thebes, suffered brutal repression. Thebes was razed, its walls demolished, and its inhabitants scattered. Through this show of force, Alexander demonstrated that he would not tolerate any insubordination. Frightened, most of the other cities accepted his hegemony. Once order was restored in Greece, Alexander once again summoned the representatives of the cities to reaffirm the principles of the League of Corinth. In this coalition, all cities theoretically retained their political autonomy, but they committed not to wage war against each other and to recognize Macedonia as the leading power. The members of the League also recognized Alexander as hegemon, supreme leader, and strategos autokrator, military leader with full powers, with a view to waging the long-awaited war against the Persian Empire. This project of a pan-Hellenic crusade against the Persians stemmed from the history of the Persian Wars, fought a century and a half earlier when the Greeks had to unite to repel the Achaemenid invasion. Philip II had already used this common memory to federate the Greek cities behind him, arguing that past outrages needed to be avenged, and that the Greek cities of Asia Minor, still under Persian rule, needed liberation. Alexander adopted this argument, seeing in it not only a means to perpetuate his father's policy, but also an opportunity to engage his troops in a gigantic military adventure. It was in Corinth that Alexander had a notable encounter with the Cynic philosopher Diogenes. He was famous for his frankness, rejection of wealth, and provocative attitude, not hesitating to challenge the powerful and ridicule the social norms of his time. Diogenes lived in a barrel and advocated a return to absolute simplicity. Intrigued by his reputation, Alexander decided to visit him. When he arrived in front of the philosopher, he found him lying in the sun, indifferent to the sovereign's presence and his entourage. Curious, Alexander asked him, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Without even looking up, Diogenes calmly and detachedly replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." The court, stunned, held its breath, but instead of taking offense, Alexander burst into laughter. He then declared, "If I were not Alexander, I would choose to be Diogenes." In the spring of 334, before Christ, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the present-day Dardanelles Strait, with an army determined to expel the Persians from Asia Minor. The Macedonian and Greek contingents comprised about 30,000 infantrymen and 5,000 cavalry, including the famous Companions' Cavalry, the backbone of Alexander's army. The adventure began with a decisive first confrontation on the bank of the Granicus River. The Battle of the Granicus took place in the extreme northwest of Asia Minor. The Persian satraps, supported by Greek mercenaries, had amassed their troops on the opposite bank, hoping to dissuade Alexander from crossing the river. The latter, far from being impressed, ordered a daring crossing. Leading his cavalry, he ventured into the waters of the Granicus as a determined leader, catching the Persians off guard with his audacity. The Macedonian phalanx, organized in tight ranks and armed with long spears, followed closely. Once they reached the other bank, Alexander's soldiers quickly formed their lines. While the phalanx fixed the enemy center, the companions' cavalry charged on the flanks. The Persian satraps, poorly coordinated, struggled to respond. The clash was violent but brief. Alexander did not give the Persians time to reorganize. The battle was short-lived, and the Macedonian victory was complete. Several Persian leaders met their demise, leading to a general rout. Thanks to this success, the doors of Asia Minor opened to Alexander. The Greek cities of Ionia, Ephesus, Miletus, Halicarnassus, among others, hastened to overthrow the Persian garrisons to welcome the liberator. Alexander sometimes installs regimes favorable to his authority while granting greater political autonomy. He hopes to secure the loyalty of these cities by restoring their traditional institutions as much as possible. This strategy, where clemency and reorganization mingle, allows him to rally the local population and consolidate his rear base before continuing his route. Soon, the Macedonian troops progressed further south, heading toward Cilicia, where the confrontation with Darius III himself looms. As he progresses through Phrygia, Alexander arrives in Gordian, a city renowned for harboring an unsolvable mystery, the Gordian Knot. According to legend, this complex knot tied the yoke of King Gordios's chariot, and a prophecy stated that whoever succeeded in untying it would become the master of Asia. Curious, Alexander approaches the knot and attempts to understand its intricacies. The cords are so finely intertwined that no end is visible. Rather than laboring to untangle it, he draws his sword and slices it with a single clean stroke. Some accounts report that he then declared, "No matter how it is undone." Darius III, ruler of the vast Persian Empire, understands the gravity of the situation. He raises a vast army, composed of contingents from all provinces, and advances to confront Alexander. The numbers given by ancient sources vary, ranging from tens of thousands to several 100,000 Persian soldiers. In any case, Darius's numerical superiority is evident, and he counts on this mass of warriors to overwhelm Alexander's army. The two armies eventually meet in the plain of Issos, northeast of the Mediterranean, in a relatively enclosed area between the sea and the mountains. Alexander, always keen about the terrain, sees an advantage in this. The layout of the land prevents Darius from fully exploiting his numbers. The Macedonians, better disciplined, know that the Persians will not be able to deploy their entire front line. But before the armies clash, Darius III made one last attempt to negotiate. Aware that Alexander's rise threatened his empire, he sent emissaries to propose a generous diplomatic agreement. He offered half of his empire in exchange for the end of hostilities. The offer was tempting. It guaranteed Alexander an immense share of territory without having to risk an uncertain battle. Parmenion, one of the most loyal Macedonian generals, thought it was an opportunity to seize. He then declared, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." But Alexander, faithful to his limitless ambition, confidently replied, "So would I if I were Parmenion." With a categorical tone, he refused Darius's offer. For him, there was no question of sharing the Persian Empire. He wanted to conquer it entirely. When the battle begins, the Macedonian infantry in phalanx formation holds back the Persian attack in the center. On the flanks, the Macedonian cavalry maneuvers to take the enemy from behind. Darius, positioned at the center of his lines, sees Alexander advancing in his direction. According to the tradition reported by Arrian and Plutarch, the sight of Alexander at the head of his companions causes confusion among the Persians. Fearing encirclement, Darius loses his composure and hastily leaves the battlefield, abandoning his treasure, his camp, and even his family. Alexander's victory is complete. This rout of the Persian army has major consequences. Psychologically, it shatters the prestige of Darius, who now appears as a ruler fleeing before the Macedonian threat. Politically, it prompts many satraps and local governors to come to terms with Alexander, convinced that the Persian Empire will never again be able to repel such an invasion. Alexander, on his part, treats Darius's family with respect, a gesture seen as magnanimous and earning him the esteem of certain Eastern elites. Following his victory at Issus, Alexander turned towards Phoenicia, a wealthy coastal region located in present-day Lebanon. The Phoenician cities were renowned for their navy and commercial activities. Most, impressed by the Macedonian power, surrendered without resistance. Only Tyre, situated on a fortified island, refused to submit. Alexander then undertook a memorable siege, during which he built a causeway to connect the island to the mainland and bring his war machines closer to the walls. The operation required months of work, but it demonstrated the conqueror's perseverance, who tolerated no obstacle. Finally, Tyre succumbed after a bloody assault, sending a clear message to any cities tempted to defy Alexander. In the aftermath, he moved south and entered Egypt, a province also under Persian control. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, welcomed Alexander enthusiastically. Seeing him as a liberator, they willingly recognized his power. In Memphis, Alexander had himself crowned as pharaoh, thus assuming a title inherited from millennia of religious tradition. For the Egyptian priests, this recognition deified the new ruler, placing him in the lineage of ancient Egyptian kings. During his stay, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria, near the mouth of the Nile. It was one of the first cities of this name, destined for a major role, a cultural and commercial crossroads between the Mediterranean and the African world. The future Alexandria would become an essential center of knowledge and trade. Alexander entrusted the city's design to Greek architects, ensuring it featured a geometric plan and modern port facilities. Alexander's quest was not limited to administrative organization. He embarked on a journey across the desert to reach the Siwa oasis, where the oracle of Ammon, an Egyptian deity assimilated to the Greek Zeus, was located. Ancient accounts describe a mysterious encounter, during which Alexander allegedly received confirmation of his divine lineage, or at least assurance that he was destined for great achievements. Whatever the historical degree of this story, it reinforced the quasi-mythical aura surrounding Alexander, who no longer considered himself merely as a Macedonian king, but as a universal ruler, legitimized by the gods. Reassured about his situation in Egypt, Alexander once again turned towards the east, where Darius III had mustered a massive army in an attempt to save his empire. The two adversaries met at Gaugamela in the plains of Assyria, near present-day Mosul in Iraq. Darius carefully chose an open terrain, ideal for maneuvering his chariots and exploiting his numerical superiority. It is said that he had the ground leveled to eliminate any obstacles that might hinder his deployment. Alexander, aware of the danger, carefully prepared his formations. His phalanx, arranged in echelon, protected the center, while the companion cavalry stood ready to strike at the flanks. At the crucial moment of the battle, the Persian chariots charged forth, but the Macedonian phalanx let them pass through its ranks, destabilizing their charge. The disciplined Macedonians repelled the Persian infantry and eventually threatened Darius directly. As at Issus, Darius lost courage and fled, abandoning the battlefield a second time. The defeat of Darius III at Gaugamela was decisive. Now, without real command, the Persian army disintegrated, and Alexander could advance without encountering significant resistance towards Babylon's Susa and soon Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. At Babylon, the inhabitants welcomed the victor as a true liberator, relieved to be freed from the fiscal and military burdens imposed by a fleeing sovereign. At Susa, Alexander seized the treasures accumulated over centuries, further strengthening his financial resources. He would soon have the opportunity to take over Persepolis, the very symbol of Persian power, part of which he would destroy, marking the end of an era and the rise of his own empire. With the victory at Gaugamela, Alexander gains effective control over the historical heart of the Persian Empire. The local satraps and governors understand that hoping for a resurgence from Darius III is now in vain, as his authority has collapsed. Many rally to Alexander, who sometimes keeps them in their positions to ensure the continuity of the administration. This conciliatory approach, already observed in Egypt and Asia Minor, aims to ease tensions and take advantage of competent cadres. Despite some resistance, the strategy works. In less than 2 years, Alexander has moved from the status of an intruder to that of the new master of the East, supported by a battle-hardened army and confident in his invincibility. The gates of Babylon, Susa, and soon Persepolis open before him, revealing immense treasures and administrative archives that allow him to better understand the mechanisms of Persian power. He also discovers an ancient civilization with its own organization, rites, and royal protocols. Gradually, Alexander begins to adopt some Persian customs, inspiring admiration from those who see it as proof that he wants to unite two worlds, but also suspicion from many Macedonians, worried about seeing him behave like an Oriental king. Nevertheless, at this point in history, nothing seems able to stop Alexander's march. In 2 great battles, Issus and Gaugamela, he has overthrown an empire that once spanned 3 continents. With an ever wider network of territories and allies, he approaches an unprecedented ambition in antiquity to found a universal empire, bringing together under his authority the peoples of the Mediterranean and Asia. This will be one of the keys to understanding Alexander's epic. Having started from a region once considered marginal by the great Greek cities, he has managed to defeat the most formidable enemy of the Hellenic sphere, while gradually adopting the role of a cosmopolitan ruler. The sack and burning of Persepolis remain among the most controversial episodes of Alexander's campaign. Ancient historians offer several explanations. Some see it as an act of vengeance for the destruction the Persians inflicted on Greek temples and cities during the Persian Wars a century earlier. Others believe the burning resulted from an uncontrolled drinking spree, with Alexander having succumbed to the excesses of his companions during a feast. Whatever the motivations, the consequence is drastic. The former ceremonial capital, symbol of a multi-century empire, is devastated. Its palaces and ruins mark the end of an era and announce the advent of a new power, embodied by the young Macedonian sovereign. During these same months, Darius III, fleeing eastward, desperately tries to rally satraps still loyal. But his stature is irreparably compromised by his previous defeats and hasty retreats. He fails to assemble a significant army, especially as several Persian officers, like Bessus, harbor their own ambitions. Eventually, Darius is captured by a group of Persian conspirators led by Bessus and dies shortly after, under circumstances still debated. According to some accounts, he was stabbed or left wounded by his guards. When Alexander finds the body of the Persian king, he organizes a funeral befitting his rank, hoping to win the sympathy of part of the local nobility. With Darius's disappearance, it is the Achaemenid dynasty itself that fades, leaving Alexander as the sole master of an immense territory. After the fall of Persepolis and the death of Darius III, Alexander proclaims himself the legitimate heir of the Persian Empire. He calls himself King of Kings, thus adopting the traditional title of the great Achaemenid kings. To establish this new authority, he adopts certain customs of the Persian court, which he deems useful for governing a vast multi-ethnic ensemble. These changes include wearing Oriental costumes, organizing sumptuous ceremonies, and introducing a protocol that clearly hierarchizes approaches to the sovereign. This desire for assimilation also extends to the administration. Alexander does not merely appoint Macedonians or Greeks to positions of responsibility. He retains or promotes several Persian dignitaries, convinced that these men, familiar with local traditions, will help him govern most effectively. He even offers mixed marriages between his Macedonian officers and Persian nobles, considering this practice an effective means of merging the elites. However, these innovations provoke diverse reactions within the Macedonian army. Some officers, proud of their traditions and wary of barbarian customs, look unfavorably on their king, dressing like a Persian or surrounding himself with Eastern advisors. Beyond mere cultural shock, they fear that adopting Persian luxury might corrupt the Macedonian military spirit, once forged in rigor and discipline. These tensions will grow over the months, eventually crystallizing during major crises, notably when Alexander demands that the Macedonians practice the Proskynesis. As Mesopotamia and central Persia fall under his control, Alexander continues eastward to track down the last pockets of resistance. He first goes to Bactria, a region roughly corresponding to the north of present-day Afghanistan. It is there that Bessus, having taken the title of Artaxerxes IV, attempts to maintain the struggle by claiming to be the legitimate successor to Darius III. Alexander then engages in a series of difficult campaigns marked by mountainous and desert terrain, steep passes, and fortresses perched on abrupt elevations. The inhabitants, skilled in guerrilla warfare, regularly launch raids against his troops, forcing the conqueror to employ all his logistical and tactical expertise. To ensure control of these remote lands, Alexander builds or restores several citadels. He also founds new colonies, often named Alexandria. More than a dozen are recorded throughout the empire. These strategic points serve as garrisons, administrative centers, and cultural bastions where Macedonian or Greek veterans settle. Gradually, these cities become commercial and political hubs, spreading Greek influence to neighboring regions. It is also in Bactria that Alexander seals his union with Roxana, daughter of a local noble. The marriage, celebrated with rites blending Macedonian traditions and Eastern customs, has strong symbolic significance. It aims to legitimize his dominion by allying with the region's aristocracy. Roxana, described as very beautiful by ancient chroniclers, thus becomes one of the queens of Alexander's empire, even though she will remain practically distant from strategic decisions. This event confirms Alexander's integration strategy, seeking to align with local practices to better establish his authority. The further Alexander distances himself from Macedonia and the Greek world, the more he immerses himself in Persian customs and representations of power. A particularly revealing incident occurs when he attempts to introduce the Proskynesis at court. This practice, inherited from Persian tradition, involves bowing very low or even prostrating before the sovereign to show veneration. Although it is customary for Eastern nobles, it deeply shocks Macedonians and Greeks, for whom such a gesture is reserved for the gods. Many perceive in this demand Alexander's desire to be worshipped like a deity, which offends their sense of equality among citizens, even if, in fact, Macedonia remains a monarchy. The Proskynesis becomes the symbol of what is seen as an absolutist drift. Several high-ranking officers refuse to comply, fueling a climate of dissent. Alexander, offended, threatens those who disobey with the loss of their ranks and privileges. This episode reveals the growing divide between the king and the traditional frameworks of the Macedonian army, attached to the camaraderie of yesteryear and the simplicity of Greek life. In an already tense context, an even more serious issue erupts. Alexander suspects a plot to assassinate him, allegedly involving Philotas, one of his closest companions, and Parmenion, the latter's father, a respected general since the time of Philip II. Philotas is accused of failing to report a conspiracy plot in time, equating to an act of treason. Tried expeditiously, he is condemned to death. Subsequently, Alexander also has Parmenion executed, fearing that he might seek vengeance for his son or rally other officers to his cause. These two executions resound like a thunderclap in the Macedonian army. Parmenion, a revered veteran, was considered a pillar of the conquest. His elimination, justified or not, testifies to Alexander's hardening stance towards his subordinates, as well as his refusal to tolerate any dissimulation or lukewarmness towards his authority. From that moment, many officers measure the risk of contesting the king's choices. Fear sets in, and Alexander is increasingly perceived as an authoritarian, even suspicious ruler. The years following the entry into the Persian Empire thus witnessed a slow and profound change in Alexander's attitude. From a young conqueror, galvanized by the military epic, he transforms into a monarch concerned with universal legitimacy, wishing to reign not only on the battlefields, but also in the minds of the subdued peoples. This ambition leads him to want to reconcile Macedonian tradition with Persian customs, while exerting ever stricter control over his officers. His court begins to take on the appearance of an imperial court, complete with protocol, splendor, and intrigues. Some historians believe that this evolution is the result of his philosophical education. Aristotle had introduced him to the idea of a cosmopolitan empire, transcending ethnic rivalries. Others view it as a mere consequence of conquest. Ruling over a territory immensely larger than Macedonia requires new political and cultural tools. Still, others speak of the growing thirst for power and the temptation to identify with semi-divine figures, encouraged by the flattery of certain courtiers. Whatever the case, this turning point proves crucial for the continuation of the adventure. Alexander no longer sees himself merely as a victorious Greek king, but as the master of a universal empire he intends to unify in his own way. This desire for unification, however, is not unanimous. Some Macedonians view with concern the growing prominence given to Persians and other Eastern peoples in the administration, as well as the geographical distance from their native lands. Furthermore, the conquests continue, and the political climate, along with the campaigning conditions, prove increasingly demanding. Alexander's personality, under the constant strain of movements, battles, and intrigues, tends to harden further. He no longer hesitates to act against anyone who offends him or seems suspicious. The virtues of clemency and solidarity that had made him popular at the beginning of his reign fade, replaced by the concern to perpetuate his nascent empire, even at the cost of fear and constraint. Alexander was renowned for his ability to drink large quantities of alcohol, a trait that intensified throughout his conquests. In Bactria, during a banquet, he organized a drinking contest where his companions were to empty an immense cup filled with pure wine, undiluted. His friend Promachus, eager to impress the king, drank so much that he died 3 days later. This event illustrates the excess and intensity of Macedonian festivities, but also the extravagance surrounding Alexander and his entourage. At the turn of the year 327, before Christ, Alexander has already managed to control a vast empire, stretching from Greece to Egypt and from Mesopotamia to Bactria. But his ambition does not stop there. In the Greek imagination of the time, the known world has eastern boundaries that fade into barely explored territories. These lands, some identify as the end of the world or the edge of the ultimate ocean, exert considerable fascination. Alexander intends to reach them, both to quench his curiosity and to assert his universal supremacy. Ancient accounts describe this desire to progress ever further as an almost legendary quest, where the conqueror seeks to reach the extremities of the earth, where the sun rises. This objective leads him to cross the foothills of the Hindu Kush, then penetrate the plains of Punjab in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent. It is in these regions that one of the most famous episodes of Alexander's epic unfolds, the encounter with King Porus and the battles involving the legendary war elephants. Since antiquity, the Greeks have harbored all sorts of representations of India, which they imagine as being inhabited by exotic creatures and rich in precious resources. They have heard of elephants, spices, gold, but also of immense rivers and mysterious cities. Alexander, nourished by epics and eager for discoveries, wishes to confront his troops with this territory, reputedly almost mythical. Strategically, he also hopes to establish his authority over the fertile valleys of the Indus, populated by numerous kingdoms that once escaped Persian control. Conquering these regions means prolonging the victorious dynamic that carried him to Bactria, and perhaps opening up the route to an unknown ocean. To realize this ambitious project, Alexander carefully prepares his itinerary. He has already taken the time, during previous campaigns, to build fortified bases and appoint trusted satraps in the newly conquered territories. His army, though tested by long years of war and by difficult geographical conditions, is once again preparing to traverse steep passes, cross the Hindu Kush, and then descend into the plains of the Indus. The route is littered with dangers, dealing with the elements, subduing or rallying local chieftains, and maintaining a complex logistical network. But Alexander remains confident. In his eyes, the continuation of conquest in these distant lands is the natural extension of his victorious momentum. Arrived in the region of Punjab, Alexander discovers a territory fragmented into numerous kingdoms or principalities led by local rajas. Some, fearing Macedonian power, choose negotiation from the outset and submit without a fight. Others, more wary or proud of their independence, try to resist. Alexander then mobilizes his experience in conquest. He advances in stages, secures each strategic city, and places garrisons to prevent revolts. The most hostile cities are treated severely, while those that rally receive lenient treatment. This method, previously tested in Asia Minor and Bactria, proves effective. Quickly, the fear of the Macedonian army prompts the majority of local leaders to negotiate with the conqueror. Across the Indus, Alexander enlists the services of engineers and builders who design makeshift bridges, sometimes using boats assembled on site. He also has the option to rely on the fleet built a few months earlier to facilitate the transport of troops and equipment. The crossing of this sacred river has significant symbolic importance. According to the Greek geography of the time, the Indus constitutes one of the last great boundaries before the ends of the earth. By crossing it, Alexander and his men feel they are entering a mysterious zone, almost out of time. The most famous clash of this campaign takes place on the banks of the Hydaspes, another great river located in the region of Punjab, now called Jhelum. There, Alexander faces King Porus, ruler of a vast kingdom, renowned for his charisma and the bravery of his troops. Porus has a formidable asset, numerous war elephants, whose mere presence is often enough to frighten the enemy. These colossi, covered with colorful fabrics and equipped with towers for archers, crush everything in their path. For his part, Alexander knows how to adapt. He waits for a rainy night to deceive the vigilance of Indian scouts and to cross the river at a less guarded point. During the battle, he chooses to use his famous companion cavalry to harass the enemy's flanks, while his heavily armed phalanxes hold the center where Porus's elephants mass. The Macedonians quickly understand they must avoid frontal charges against these imposing beasts. They retreat, throw javelins, unsettle the mahouts, and aim to injure the elephants' legs. As the battle unfolds, chaos ensues in Porus's ranks. Some elephants, frightened, turn against their own troops. This confusion proves fatal to the Indian army, which, despite courageous resistance, must give way to Alexander's discipline and tactical flexibility. At the end of the battle, Porus is captured. Impressed by his courage and demeanor, Alexander treats him with all due respect. According to the accounts, he asks Porus how he wishes to be treated. Porus responds proudly, "Like a king." Flattered by the dignity of this prisoner, Alexander reinstates him on his throne, enlarged and placed under Macedonian sovereignty. This policy, blending firmness and clemency, proves once again effective. Porus remains loyal to Alexander, providing a useful local ally to maintain peace in the region. After the Hydaspes, Alexander incorporates into his own ranks several elephants captured or offered by allied rajas. The idea is to become familiar with these animals that have so impressed his soldiers. Aware that the elephant constitutes a psychological weapon before being a tactical advantage, he sees in these beasts a way to reinforce the fear inspired by the Macedonian army among local populations. However, the Macedonians' lack of experience with elephants presents a challenge. There is a need to train mahouts, adapt food supplies, and ensure cohesion with the cavalry and phalanx. Alexander therefore relies on the expertise of Indian specialists, and some Macedonian officers attempt this training. While not yet a decisive force in future battles, these elephants make the army more impressive in the eyes of the peoples yet to be subdued. As Alexander plans to continue his advance eastward, signs of exhaustion and fatigue multiply among his men. For nearly 10 years, the Macedonian phalanx has traveled thousands of kilometers, engaging in battles, enduring extreme climatic conditions, and living far from their homelands. The region's resources, though rich, do not suffice to compensate for the hardships. Monsoon rains, scorching heat, tropical diseases, and difficulties in communicating with populations speaking different languages. The veterans murmur their discontent, especially as the conquest seems to continue indefinitely without a clearly defined objective. Many long to return, to enjoy their spoils and privileges, or at least to station in a more peaceful area. In response to the growing insistence of his officers and soldiers, Alexander attempts to argue. He speaks of glory, self-surpassing, and the promise of discovering the ocean beyond the Indian rivers. He explains that, according to the maps he possesses, there might be little distance left before they reach the eastern shores of the world. Yet, for the first time, he faces a true moral revolt. The exhausted army makes it clear that they do not want to advance further. Chronicles report that he eventually capitulates to the collective will, announcing, not without bitterness, that they will turn back. A decisive moment, marking the tangible limit of the eastern expansion. Macedonia and its allies will not explore beyond the plains of Punjab, and the dreamed end of the world remains out of reach. The decision to return does not mean tranquility. On the journey back, Alexander wishes to avoid simply retracing his steps. He aims to explore new regions in the south, follow the Indus Valley to its mouth, then cross the Gedrosian Desert, today's Balochistan, between Pakistan and Iran, to reach the Persian provinces of his empire. The goal is twofold: to extend his control to potentially rich coastal zones, and, according to some interpretations, to organize a network of ports along the shores to facilitate maritime trade. But Gedrosia proves to be a logistical nightmare. The arid climate, extreme heat, and lack of potable water cause heavy losses. The accounts speak of sandstorms, dried-up rivers, and caravans lost in the vast desert. Many soldiers, servants, and animals perish from thirst or exhaustion. Alexander himself suffers greatly seeing his troops decimated. Some historians consider it a psychological turning point for the conqueror, whose drive to push his borders now exacts a heavy human toll. Despite these trials, the army eventually reached the region of Carmania, southern Iran today, where it could rest, replenish its supplies, and reconnect with Macedonian garrisons stationed further west. This perilous crossing, although it enhanced Alexander's aura as an explorer and daring leader, further deepened the survivors' weariness. The ranks were thinned, and the atmosphere within the army oscillated between admiration and resentment. Many acknowledged his genius, but reproached him for constantly demanding more sacrifices. At the beginning of the year 324, before Christ, after years of campaigning across Asia, Alexander made his grand return to Babylon. His reputation was now that of a virtually invincible conqueror, a man who had pushed the boundaries of the Greek world to the gates of India. Upon returning to Babylon, Alexander intended to transform this historic city into a true nerve center of his vast empire. Once the capital of prestigious Mesopotamian empires, Babylon offered several advantages. Its geographical position in the heart of Mesopotamia facilitated communications with the eastern and western satrapies, while its infrastructures, temples, and the fertility of the neighboring lands made it a suitable location for establishing an imperial court. Upon his arrival, Alexander initiated reforms to strengthen the administration. He confirmed certain satraps in their posts, whether they were Macedonian or Persian, and replaced others accused of corruption or inefficiency. Concerned with stability, he required that taxes be collected more rigorously, while guaranteeing the local populations a degree of cultural autonomy. New garrisons, mainly composed of experienced soldiers, were established in strategic cities to prevent possible revolts and to defend trade routes. One of the most notable actions during this period was the organization in Susa of a mass wedding ceremony between Macedonian officers and women from the Persian aristocracy. Alexander himself married two Persian princesses, Statera, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes III. Several thousand of his soldiers were encouraged to do the same, in a move aimed at bringing Greek and Persian elites closer. The official goal of this policy was to forge a multicultural entity where the victor and the vanquished would form a single people loyal to the sovereign. These marriages, however, did not excite everyone. Some officers accepted the new union to please the king, but later repudiated their Persian wives at the first opportunity as soon as Alexander was no longer present. The Macedonian and Greek base, on the other hand, proved reluctant to the idea of mixing customs and lineages. Many saw this fusion policy as an abandonment of Hellenic traditions and a betrayal of the very spirit of conquest, which was supposed, in their view, to preserve the military and cultural supremacy of Macedonia. Despite these objections, Alexander persisted, convinced that his empire could only endure by fully integrating the conquered peoples. Alongside his administrative reforms, Alexander still harbored military ambitions. His sights were set on Arabia, a vast peninsula that, according to the Greeks, contained important trade routes linking the east to the Horn of Africa. Conquering Arabia would mean for him to fully control maritime traffic of the Red Sea and strengthen the economic cohesion of his empire. Babylon, halfway between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, would then become an essential strategic hub. The preparation for this expedition was underway. Alexander ordered the construction of a fleet, assigned exploration missions to chart the peninsula's shores, and sent emissaries to offer local tribes the chance to submit peacefully. However, the project would never see the light of day, abruptly interrupted by the king's death. According to some ancient sources, Alexander also contemplated new conquests to the west, notably towards Cyrenaica, modern-day Libya, or even Carthage. Other rumors spoke of even more audacious projects, launching a fleet to explore the Atlantic coasts of Africa, or bypassing Arabia by sea to find a maritime route to the Mediterranean. Whether these were concrete plans or mere speculations, it remains clear that Alexander did not envision halting his endeavors. To him, the world still had vast spaces to offer, and his empire was to encompass all civilized lands. In June 323, before Christ, Alexander, barely 32 years old, was struck by a violent fever during a banquet in Babylon. His condition rapidly deteriorated. He suffered from abdominal pain, dehydration, and extreme weakness. In a matter of days, the conqueror, who seemed invincible on the battlefield, passed away, leaving behind a colossal empire and no clear succession. Ancient chroniclers, such as Plutarch and Arrian, report various theories on the cause of his death. Some mention a disease like malaria, prevalent in the swampy regions of Mesopotamia. Others see it as the result of poisoning orchestrated by officers or courtiers fearing the king's growing absolutism. Another hypothesis suggests that alcohol, combined with Alexander's chronic overexertion and general state of fatigue, contributed to a fatal crisis. Whatever the speculations, Alexander's death leaves his companions in shock. Many of them thought he was invincible, even protected by the gods. His sudden disappearance profoundly shakes the morale of the troops and raises the most pressing question: who will take command of the empire? Upon hearing of the king's death, the Macedonian army stationed in Babylon and the surrounding provinces is plunged into dismay. The soldiers, exhausted and lost, no longer know to whom to pledge loyalty. Alexander had not left a male heir of age to rule. His unborn child with Roxana had yet to come into the world. Thus begins a period of bargaining and negotiation among the principal generals, known as diadochi, meaning successors, each claiming a right to power. The Macedonian troops initially demand an heir from the dynasty to lead them. It is eventually decided that Philip III Aristotle, Alexander's half-brother, considered mentally deficient, will nominally rule alongside Roxana's future son, the young Alexander IV, but under the tutelage of the diadochi. The generals then divide the administrative and military responsibilities of the empire, pending a more permanent solution. The fragile compromise quickly falls apart. The generals distrust each other and fear that a rival might seize the entire territory. Alliances form and dissolve, and each diadoch seeks to control the richest or most strategic parts of the empire. One of them, Perdiccas, initially regent, is swiftly ousted. Ptolemy, settled in Egypt, asserts his claims over this key province. Seleucus, another prominent officer, takes control of the eastern satrapies, Babylonia, then Syria. Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Cassander vie for Macedonia, Asia Minor, and Greece. These struggles, which span nearly 40 years, are marked by successive wars. The ephemeral kings, Philip III, Aristotle, and Alexander IV, are eventually eliminated, as well as other members of the royal family. The empire's unity ultimately shatters, replaced by several independent and often rival kingdoms. Following the wars of succession that tear apart the empire of Alexander the Great, powerful kingdoms emerge, shaping a new era, the Hellenistic period. Among them is the Ptolemaic kingdom, founded in Egypt by Ptolemy and his dynasty, which will reign until Cleopatra nearly 3 centuries later. To the east, the Seleucid kingdom, initially centered in Babylonia and then in Syria, extends over a vast territory from Asia Minor to Persia, before gradually losing its eastern provinces. In Macedonia, the Antigonid kingdom perpetuates the legacy of Antigonus the One-Eyed, while in Asia Minor, the kingdom of Pergamon emerges under the Attalid dynasty. In these cosmopolitan states, where Greek traditions mingle with Eastern influences, a civilization of unprecedented richness is born. In Alexandria, Antioch, or Pergamon, philosophy, science, arts, and architecture flourish, giving rise to a world where Greek heritage is transformed and disseminated, profoundly marking the history of the Mediterranean and the Near East. The death of Alexander in Babylon immediately raises the question of his burial. According to Macedonian rites, he should have been returned to Macedonia, the land of his ancestors. But Ptolemy, one of the most influential diadochi, is said to have intercepted the funeral procession to bring it to Egypt. For Ptolemy, housing Alexander's remains in his future capital is a way to affirm his legitimacy and attract popular veneration. Numerous ancient testimonies mention the presence of Alexander's sarcophagus in Memphis, then in Alexandria, in a magnificent mausoleum where visitors came to pay homage to the deceased conqueror. However, by the end of antiquity, the sources become scarcer. Over the course of invasions, reconstructions, and religious upheavals, the exact location where Alexander rests is lost. Modern historians and archaeologists have multiplied hypotheses, some trying to locate this tomb in Alexandria, in the undergrounds of the ancient city, others suggesting it might have been moved or destroyed. To this day, the mystery remains. no indisputable archaeological discovery has confirmed the location of Alexander's burial site. Beyond the question of his remains, Alexander's impact on human history remains immense. His brief existence was enough to upset the political and cultural balance of a vast part of the ancient world. Under his rule, the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia witnessed an unprecedented exchange of knowledge, arts, techniques, and religions. Urban foundations, more than a dozen Alexandria, served as relays for the expansion of Greek culture, while adopting local artistic and cultural elements. The Hellenistic period, a direct result of his epic, sees the blossoming of major innovations. Philosophers and scholars, supported by the patronage of Alexander's successor kings, accelerated progress in astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. The famous Library of Alexandria, built under the Ptolemies, symbolizes this intellectual effervescence that would mark Western civilization enduringly. From the fusion between Greece and the Orient, new forms of spirituality, new scientific approaches, and an unprecedented openness of the mind towards the universal are born. Alexander's impact goes far beyond the military realm. He was the vector of a profound geopolitical and cultural transformation, the repercussions of which would be felt up to the Roman Empire and beyond. Legendary for the speed and extent of his conquests, he is equally renowned for the impetus he gave to the movement of people and knowledge. His successors, born from the fragmentation of his empire, would prolong this Hellenistic legacy for several centuries, ensuring that his name, inextricably linked to the glory, but also the paradoxes of a conqueror turned cosmopolitan king, never fades into oblivion.